She walked into that auction wearing a patched dress and carrying nothing but her mother's memory. And they laughed. Every last one of them laughed. The richest women in Red Hollow pointed their gloved fingers at her waistline, at her worn-out boots, at the hand-stitched hem that had come slightly undone from the long road. They didn't see a woman. They saw a joke. But here's what none of them knew. The woman they were laughing at was holding documents in that battered satchel that could destroy every powerful family in that town. And the one man nobody expected to care was already watching her. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Chapter 1. Dust on the road, dust in the heart. The morning Marlowe Pierce rode into Red Hollow, the sky was the color of an old bruise, that particular shade of purple and yellow that comes just before the heat settles in and refuses to leave. She had been on the road for 11 days. 11 days of sleeping in the wagon bed with a canvas tarp pulled over her and her mother's old trunk, eating hardtack and dried apples, talking to the mule more than she talked to herself because at least the mule didn't judge the silences. His name was Grover, the mule, not a person. Her mother had named him after a senator she admired, which Marlowe always found funny because Grover the mule had approximately the same opinion of everyone, mild suspicion followed by complete indifference. "Almost there," she told him, as they crested the last ridge and Red Hollow spread out below them in the valley. Grover flicked one ear back and kept walking. The town was bigger than she expected. She'd heard about it from travelers passing through Sulphur Creek, heard it called a frontier town, a cattle town, a rough-and-tumble place where money talked loud and everything else kept quiet. What she saw from the ridge looked almost respectable. There was a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without cursing each other, a hotel with a painted sign, a church with a real glass window, several storefronts with actual wooden facades rather than the canvas and mud constructions she'd grown up around. But she also noticed the things that didn't make it into the favorable descriptions. The way the nicer buildings clustered at the center while the edges of town bled into shacks and lean-tos that looked like they'd been built in a hurry and never improved. The way the main street had a quality side and a working side, and nobody seemed confused about which was which. She clicked her tongue, and Grover descended the ridge at his own pace, which was the only pace he ever went. The annual Red Hollow Cattle and Trade Auction ran for 3 days every summer. Marlowe had timed her arrival for the second day, early enough to get a decent spot, late enough that the initial chaos of setup would be done. She had 12 garments in that trunk, 12 pieces her mother had spent the better part of 2 years making before her hands got too bad, and then before her lungs got worse, and then before everything got worse all at once. There were 2-day dresses in cotton so fine it practically whispered. 3 work shirts for men, the kind with the reinforced shoulders and the careful pocket stitching that actually held up to real use. A riding skirt with hidden gussets at the hip that allowed for actual movement, which was rarer than it should have been. A child's coat with hand-embroidered flowers at the collar. And at the very bottom of the trunk, wrapped in the one piece of tissue paper Marlowe had been able to save, a wedding dress that her mother had started as a commission and finished because she couldn't bear to leave something half done. That wedding dress was worth more than everything else combined. Marlowe knew it. She also knew she had to sell it, along with the rest, because the roof on the Sulphur Creek property needed replacing before winter, and the well had gone brackish, and Grover needed new shoes, and she needed to eat. She found the Merchant's Row along the east side of the auction grounds, and paid the 2-cent registration fee to a bored young man in a collar that was too tight for his neck. He wrote her name in the ledger without looking up, handed her a numbered card, 37, and gestured vaguely down the row toward the remaining empty spots. Her spot was between a man selling leather goods and a gap where someone had apparently registered and then not shown up, leaving an empty table that made her end of the row feel a little lonely. She didn't mind. She set up her mother's trunk, spread the blue wool blanket she used as a display cloth, and began laying out the garments with the same careful attention her mother had always used. She was pinning the riding skirt to the small display frame she'd built from willow branches when she first heard the laughter. Not at her. Not yet. It was just the ambient laughter of a social gathering, the kind that floats through a crowd and doesn't mean anything specific. Women in good dresses clustered near the main pavilion, fanning themselves against the heat. Men in good hats talked cattle prices and politics. Children ran between adult legs, getting gently scolded. Marlowe kept working. She straightened the child's coat. She folded the men's shirts with the careful precision her mother had drilled into her. Always fold along the seam, never against it. A crease in the wrong place tells the customer the maker doesn't pay attention. She unwrapped the wedding dress last and held it up briefly to check that it had survived the journey without major wrinkling, then wrapped it back and kept it in the trunk. The wedding dress was for serious inquiries only. You didn't display something like that to the general crowd and let it collect dust and handling. By mid-morning, the auction grounds had filled considerably. The cattle side was loud, the sound of animals and men shouting prices carrying across the grounds in waves. The merchants' row was more civilized in volume, if not always in character. A few people drifted past Marlowe's table, glanced at the garments, moved on. A couple stopped. An older woman with work-roughened hands spent a long time examining one of the men's shirts, feeling the shoulder seams, checking the buttonholes. "Your work?" the woman asked. "My mother's," Marlowe said. "She passed in February." The woman looked at her. Really looked. The kind of direct assessment that older women sometimes allowed themselves without apology. She knew what she was doing. She did. Price? They negotiated and reached an agreement in about 4 minutes, which was about how long it took when two people who both understood value were talking to each other. The shirt went with the woman, who tucked it under her arm and walked away without ceremony. And Marlowe felt the small lightening that came with a first sale, the proof that the trip had not been entirely theoretical. She was watching the crowd, thinking about whether to get some water before the midday heat really settled in, when she noticed the cluster of women near the pavilion edge. There were 4 of them, and they moved together the way women who have been important for a long time move. Not in a rush, not with any apparent goal, just with the absolute certainty that whatever direction they walked was the correct direction and everyone else would accommodate. They wore dresses that had been made by someone who charged enough to not care whether the client found the price alarming. They wore hats with actual decoration, not just ribbons, but small constructed arrangements of fabric and sometimes feathers that took real millinery skill. The one in front was the most impressive and the most difficult to look at directly, the way certain people generate a kind of social brightness that makes you want to look away. She was probably 40, maybe a little older, with the kind of beauty that had been very striking 20 years ago and had since hardened into something more like authority. Her dress was green silk, actual silk, not the imitation kind, and her hat had a small cascade of dark feathers along the left side. Later, Marlowe would learn her name was Lenora Vance. At the moment, she only knew that the woman and her group were drifting down the merchant's row in her general direction, and that they were the kind of women who noticed things. Not because they were especially observant, but because noticing things and then commenting on them was a primary social activity. Marlowe turned her attention back to her display and made a small adjustment to the riding skirt's position. She heard them stop. She heard the pause before any words. That particular silence of a group that has collectively noticed something and is deciding whether to remark on it publicly. Is that a trade table?" one of the women said. And her voice was the kind of carefully cultivated thing that managed to convey extreme delicacy while also landing every syllable with perfect clarity, so that no one within 15 feet could pretend not to have heard. Apparently so. This was the woman in green, Lenora, and her voice was different, lower, more assured. She stepped up to the table. Marlowe met her eyes. "Are you the seamstress?" Lenora asked. The word seamstress came out weighted in a way that made Marlowe understand immediately and clearly that it was not intended as a neutral description. "I'm selling my mother's work," Marlowe said. She was a skilled dressmaker. Lenora looked at the riding skirt. She looked at the day dresses. Her eyes traveled the display with the expression of someone performing an assessment for an audience, not for their own information. "How quaint," she said. One of the other women laughed. Just a small sound, quickly covered, but it carried. Marlowe kept her voice even. "The stitching is all hand-done. The cotton on the day dresses is fine weave from the Pendleton mill. It's hard to find this quality west of the Missouri." "I'm sure it's very practical," Lenora said, in the tone of someone for whom practical was not a compliment. Her gaze moved from the garments to Marlowe herself, to the dress Marlowe was wearing, which was her second best, which was patched at the left sleeve where she'd caught it on a nail 3 months ago and hadn't had time to do a proper repair, just a serviceable one. Lenore's expression shifted. Something came into her eyes that was almost satisfaction. "That dress," she said, Is that also your mother's work? Yes. It's... She tilted her head. A small smile. Well, I suppose it tells a story. The other women laughed again, less quietly this time. Two of them exchanged a look. The quick sideways glance that signals shared amusement. The kind that doesn't need words because the words aren't the point. The point is the glance itself, and being seen having it. Marlowe stood still. This was the moment. She could feel it, like a shift in air pressure, where most people would do one of two things. They would laugh along, make a self-deprecating comment, try to smooth the moment into something friendlier. Or they would flush and look down and find something very interesting to adjust on the table, which was its own kind of retreat. She did neither. She looked at Lenora or Vance directly and said, "The patch is recent. I was in a hurry and used what I had. The original construction is sound." Lenora blinked. Whatever response she had been expecting, that wasn't quite it. "How forthright," she said after a moment. "Thank you," Marlowe said, as though it had been an unambiguous compliment. Chapter 2. The Man Who Didn't Laugh. Coulter Boone had been standing near the water trough at the edge of the cattle grounds for the better part of an hour, which was not as lazy as it looked. He was watching the cattle. Specifically, he was watching a string of 15 mixed-breed steers that a rancher named Dutton was trying to pass off as mostly Angus, which they were not. They were maybe 30% Angus on a good day, and Coulter had been hired by a buyer named Prescott to watch Dutton's lot throughout the morning and see what he could see. What he could see was that Dutton had put his best three animals at the front and the back of the string where they'd be most visible, which was a classic move and not inherently dishonest, but combined with the way he was describing the lot to potential buyers, it was getting into territory that Coulter found professionally irritating. He was not a particularly complicated man, in the sense that he didn't spend a lot of time wondering what kind of man he was. He was 34 years old. He'd been working cattle and horses since he was 12, first because he needed to eat, and later because it was the work he knew, and he was good at it. He was tall enough that people noticed it when he walked into a room, and he had the kind of face that seemed permanently set in mild skepticism. Not unfriendly, but not inviting either. More than one person over the years had told him he was hard to read, which he took as a reasonable observation rather than a criticism. He didn't like crowds. He tolerated them because the work required it. Cattle auctions in particular required a kind of patience he had to consciously maintain. Too many people moving in too many directions, too much noise, too many conversations you could only hear half of and had to fill in the rest. He had been dimly aware of the merchant's row all morning, the way you're aware of something that isn't your concern but is in your field of vision. He'd registered the new table at the East End, the woman setting up the display, the blue cloth, the careful arrangement of garments. He'd noticed in the way he noticed most things, not with particular interest, just with the habit of noting what was around him. He noticed the cluster of women gather around her table. He noticed the shift in posture, hers and theirs. He was too far away to hear what was being said, but he'd been around enough gatherings of this kind to read the general shape of what was happening. The woman in green silk was performing something. The other three were her audience. The woman at the table, the one in the patched dress, was the subject. Coulter watched. What he saw from 30 feet away was that the woman at the table did not flinch. That was unusual enough to hold his attention. He'd watched the same basic scene play out in different forms, someone with less social standing getting worked over by someone with more, and the person on the receiving end almost always gave some signal of distress. A tight jaw, a drawn-up shoulder, the particular stillness of someone trying not to show that they're rattled. Natural responses to an unpleasant situation. This woman stood like she was waiting for a rainstorm to pass. Not happy about it, not unaware of it, just not giving it any particular additional territory. He found himself drifting in that direction without having made a conscious decision to do so. He arrived at the edge of the merchant's row, just as Lenora Vance was saying something to the woman in a tone that carried the absolute certainty of someone who had never been seriously contradicted in a social setting. He caught the tail end of it. Can't imagine who let you register for a space. They really ought to have standards. Two of Lenore's group laughed. Several people from nearby tables had turned to watch, the way people watch anything that has the shape of a spectacle without requiring them to participate. The woman at the table, and Coulter was close enough now to get a proper look at her, to see that she was probably 28 or 29, that she had dark eyes that were currently doing something that wasn't quite controlled anger but was in that neighborhood. Took a slow breath. "The registration fee is 2 cents, she said. Same for everyone." "Yes," Lenora said. "Well." She made a small gesture at the table that managed to encompass and dismiss everything on it simultaneously. "Standards aren't always about money, are they?" Coulter stopped next to the leather goods man at the adjacent table. "What's this about?" he said quietly to the man. The leather goods man, who was watching with the expression of someone deeply grateful not to be involved, shrugged one shoulder. "Mrs. Vance doesn't seem to appreciate the competition." Coulter looked at the garments on the table. He was no expert in fine sewing. His own clothes were chosen on the basis of durability and whether they fit, but he could see, even from here, that the stitching on those pieces was careful work, the kind of stitching where someone had taken time. The riding skirt in particular had a design element at the hip that he recognized as practical, having spent enough years on horseback to understand why that kind of thing mattered. He looked back at Lenora Vance, who was saying something now in a lower voice to one of her companions, and who glanced at the woman at the table with the expression of someone who has already made up their mind and is just deciding how to formalize it. The woman at the table was looking at her garments. Her hands were at her sides, not fidgeting. She was very still in the way that water gets still just before it starts moving very fast. Coulter stepped up to her table. "Excuse me," he said. Both women looked at him. Lenora first, then the woman at the table. "That riding skirt," he said, addressing the woman at the table. "The one on the frame. Who designed the hip construction?" She looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating quickly. "My mother. She said most riding skirts were designed by people who'd never actually ridden anything." She wasn't wrong. He looked at the skirt more carefully. "Are those gussets?" "Hidden ones. They don't show when you're standing, but they give about 4 extra inches of movement in the saddle." He picked up one edge of the skirt, not pulling it off the frame, just examining the seam. The stitching was tight and even. He'd spent enough years watching ranch hands repair their own clothes badly to recognize the difference between someone who sewed well and someone who sewed excellently. This fell into the second category. "What's your asking price?" She told him. He nodded. "That's fair. I know a woman over at the Prescott Ranch who's been complaining about her riding skirts for 2 years. I'll take her word back to her and see if she's interested." He set the skirt back on the frame with the same care he'd used to pick it up. Then he looked at Lenora Vance. Lenora had watched this exchange with an expression that had gone through several phases. Surprise, mild irritation, a recalibration of her own. Coulter Boone's name was known in this part of the territory. Not famous exactly, but known. The Vance family did business with the Prescott operation, and the Prescott operation used Coulter for cattle assessment. He was not someone Lenora could dismiss without some calculation. "Coulter," she said, in a tone that tried for familiar warmth and landed slightly short of it. "I didn't know you were interested in dressmaking." "I'm interested in quality work," he said. "Same as any other commodity." He let that sit for a moment, then looked back at the woman at the table. "I'm Coulter Boone. I do assessment work for Prescott and a few other operations in the area." "Marlowe Pierce," she said. The way she said it was steady, not performatively calm, just actually calm, which was different. "Miss Pierce," he glanced at the trunk. "You've got more in there?" "The better pieces," she said, "for serious inquiries." Something about that phrasing, the flat practicality of it, the implicit assertion that she got to decide what constituted a serious inquiry, struck him as unusually direct. He almost smiled. "Fair enough," he said. He tipped his hat to her, a brief functional gesture, and turned and walked away. Behind him, he heard Lenora Vance say something in a lower voice. He didn't catch the words, but he heard the tone, the kind of controlled irritation that announces that the conversation has shifted into a different phase. He went back to watching Dutton's cattle and thought, without particularly meaning to, about the woman with the patched dress and the very even hands. Chapter 3. The Town Beneath the Town. Red Hollow had a surface version of itself and a real version of itself, and the gap between the two was the thing that nobody talked about at parties. The surface version was a prosperous frontier community, growing, full of opportunity, the kind of place that made for good stories when you were writing letters back east. There was a school, there was a functioning civic structure, a sheriff, a mayor, a town council that met monthly in the back room of the hotel. There were 2 churches, a doctor who was sober most of the time, and a newspaper that had been publishing for 4 years without being burned down, which was not always guaranteed. The real version of Red Hollow was more complicated. The Vance family, which meant primarily Lenora Vance and her husband Hargrove Vance, who was 62 and left most of the active decisions to his wife, owned the largest cattle operation in the valley and had been systematically expanding it for the past 8 years. This was not on its face unusual. Successful ranches expanded. That was the nature of the business. The mechanism of expansion was where things got complicated. There was a pattern, and it had repeated enough times that it was no longer a coincidence. A smaller homesteader or rancher in the surrounding valley would hit a hard year, drought, illness, a bad winter, the ordinary disasters of frontier life. They would approach the local bank, which was the only bank within a day's ride, and which was run by a man named Garvey, who had what might charitably be called a close professional relationship with Hargrove Vance. A loan would be arranged. The terms would be written in the kind of language that sounded reasonable when Garvey read it aloud but looked different on paper, particularly in the sections dealing with what happened if the first payment was missed by even a few days, and what constituted the collateral, and who held the right of first acquisition in a foreclosure event. When the loan came due, and it always came due at the worst possible time, which was not a coincidence, the acquisition process moved quickly. Hargrove's lawyers were efficient. The former homesteader was left with enough to get out of the valley, but not enough to start over anywhere decent. 7 properties in 8 years, each one absorbed into the expanding Vance operation. Each one handled with enough legal structure to make it technically defensible, and enough social pressure to make it practically unchallengeable. Because who were you going to complain to? The town council, 2 of whose members had their own small business arrangements with the Vance family. The newspaper, which relied on Vance advertising revenue to keep its doors open. The people who knew about the pattern, and several people did know, or suspected, kept their knowledge to themselves for the same reason people generally keep dangerous knowledge to themselves. It's not cowardice, exactly. It's more like a very clear-eyed assessment of what you can afford to lose. Marlowe Pierce did not know any of this when she registered her table at the Red Hollow Cattle and Trade Auction, but she was about to start learning. Chapter 4. After the women left. As the group of women moved on eventually, Lenora, apparently deciding that she'd made her point, or that Coulter Boone's appearance had disrupted the dynamic beyond what was worth pursuing, gathered her companions and drifted back toward the pavilion. But the damage, such as it was, lingered in the air around Marlowe's table the way smoke lingers after the fire's out. 2 potential customers who had been approaching the table while the exchange was happening had veered away. Marlowe had watched them go with the particular frustration of watching something she couldn't prevent and couldn't address directly. She spent the next hour doing her work. A man inquired about the child's coat. His wife was expecting their second, and they were hoping for a girl, he said, with the cautious optimism of people who knew that hoping and getting were different things. He couldn't afford what Marlowe was asking, not quite, and they negotiated down to a price that was lower than she wanted, but covered at least some of the trip's cost. He shook her hand when they finished, which she appreciated. It was a small formality, but a real one. An older woman, widowed by the look of her, spent 20 minutes examining both day dresses with the thoroughness of someone who had learned to be very careful about how she spent what she had. She asked good questions about the color fastness of the dye, about whether the buttons were bone or shell, about the cut of the sleeves. Marlowe answered everything directly and honestly, including the part where she said that the indigo dye on the darker dress would probably soften by the 3rd or 4th washing, which was the truth and cost her some negotiating position. But she'd been raised in a house where lying to customers was treated as a failure of character rather than just a business mistake. The woman bought the lighter dress. She paid in coin, exact, and left without a lot of conversation, which Marlowe had no problem with. By mid-afternoon, she had sold 3 pieces and had a tentative interest on a 4th from someone who wanted to bring his wife back to look at it. Considering the morning she'd had, she decided this was acceptable. She was eating the cold biscuit she'd packed that morning and watching the crowd thin somewhat in the heat of the early afternoon when the man from earlier, Coulter Boone, came back. He came alone this time. No particular expression on his face that she could read as friendly or unfriendly, just that same quality of mild attentiveness she'd noticed before, like a person who is genuinely looking at what's in front of them rather than looking through it at something else. "Still here," he said. Not quite a question. "Still here," she confirmed. "Were you expecting otherwise?" He considered this. Lenore Vance has a way of making people decide the trouble isn't worth it. "I paid 2 cents for this table." "So you did." He stood at the edge of the table, not crowding it, looking at what remained on display. His eyes moved over the pieces with that same careful assessment he'd given the riding skirt earlier. She had the impression of a person who actually looked at things rather than just glancing at them, which was rarer than it should have been. "You from around here?" he asked. "Sulphur Creek, east of the ridge." She paused. "I've never been to Red Hollow before." First impression? She thought about this. The honest answer and the politic answer were different things, and she wasn't sure which one to give a man she'd known for approximately 40 minutes. "It has more layers than it looks like from the outside," she said finally. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the predecessor of one. "That's a fair way to put it." He looked at her. "Those women this morning. You know who she is? Lenore Vance?" "I know what she told me without using those words. Her husband owns about a third of the grazing land in the valley. They're significant." He said it with a slight quality of understatement that she noticed. "The people who tried to interfere with them before mostly left the area." Marlowe set down the remains of her biscuit. "Is that a warning?" He met her eyes steadily. "It's information. What you do with it is your own business." "I'm here to sell garments," she said. "I don't have any interest in interfering with anyone." "The Vances sometimes take an interest in people who haven't taken an interest in them," he said. "Just something to be aware of." He said it without particular drama, which made it more effective than if he'd tried to make it alarming. She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd been taught to look at situations by a mother who had survived enough of them to have opinions about what mattered. He was telling her something real. He was not telling her everything he knew. Those two things could both be true simultaneously. "Thank you," she said. "Mr. Boone." "Coulter," he said. He glanced at the trunk. "The better pieces." "Is one of them a wedding dress?" She blinked. "How did you—" "Way you handled the trunk this morning. Careful on the bottom, like there was something specific down there." He shrugged one shoulder. "I watch how people handle things. Habit." She studied him for a moment. "Yes, a wedding dress. My mother took it as a commission 5 years ago. The woman who ordered it moved away before it was finished." She paused. "My mother finished it anyway." He nodded slowly. "That sounds like something a certain kind of person does." "What kind of person?" "The kind who can't leave a thing undone." He looked at her directly. "Runs in families sometimes." She didn't answer that because she wasn't sure what to do with it. "I'll be at the auction through tomorrow," he said. "If anyone gives you trouble, I'll manage." "I know." He said it simply, like it was just a fact he'd observed and was acknowledging. "The offer still stands." He tipped his hat again, the same brief, functional gesture as before, and walked back toward the cattle grounds. Marlowe watched him go and then turned back to her table and straightened the display frame, which didn't need straightening. Chapter 5. The Evening Reckoning. The auction grounds quieted as the afternoon moved into evening. The cattle side wound down first. The animals herded back to their temporary pens, the buyers and sellers moving toward the hotel, and the saloon to continue negotiations in more comfortable surroundings. The merchants' row thinned out as people packed up their goods and stowed them for the night. Marlowe had sold 5 pieces by the time the light started going orange. That left 7, including the wedding dress. She did the math in her head, which was not encouraging. 5 sold pieces covered about half the cost of the trip, the registration fee, and Grover's expenses. The remaining 7 needed to sell tomorrow, and the wedding dress needed to sell for close to her asking price, for the whole venture to make financial sense. She was wrapping the remaining pieces carefully back into the trunk when a woman appeared at the edge of her table. She was older, maybe 55, maybe older, with a face that had been weathered by outdoor work and a quality of watchfulness about her that reminded Marlowe, faintly, of Coulter Boone. She wore a plain brown dress that was well made but not fancy, and she carried herself with the particular steadiness of someone who had decided a long time ago not to be impressed by things that weren't worth being impressed by. "You're the woman Lenora Vance decided to make an example of this morning," the woman said. Not unkindly, just as a statement of established fact. "I heard about it," Marlowe said. "I wasn't in a position to watch from the outside." The woman made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Word travels, particularly when Mrs. Vance is involved." She looked at the trunk. "Is it true you have a wedding dress in there?" "It's true." "Can I see it?" Marlowe looked at her. The assessment her mother had taught her, the one that took in posture and hands and the quality of attention in someone's eyes. She reached into the trunk and unwrapped the wedding dress. The woman made a sound that was completely involuntary. It was the sound people made when they saw something that was genuinely beautiful and hadn't been expecting it. The dress was ivory silk, not the cheap ivory silk that went yellow in a year, but the heavy, close-woven kind that kept its color, with lace at the collar and cuffs that her mother had made herself, needle-tatted over dozens of patient evenings. The waist was fitted but not constrictive. The skirt fell in a way that suggested movement rather than display. The whole thing had a quality of intention to it, every element serving the whole, nothing included just because it was expected. "Your mother made this," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "She did." The woman reached out and touched the lace very carefully with one fingertip. "I'm Catherine Rourke. My daughter is getting married in September." She looked up. "What's your asking price?" Marlowe told her. Catherine Rourke nodded slowly. She looked at the dress again for a long moment. "I need to bring my daughter to see it," she said. "Could you hold it through tomorrow morning?" "I can hold it through noon," Marlowe said. "After that, I can't guarantee it." "Noon is fine." She put out her hand and Marlowe shook it. "I'll be here at 9. She started to leave, then paused. "You held your ground well this morning. With Lenora." She said it without elaborating further, as though it was a piece of information she was passing along, and the interpretation was Marlowe's to make. Then she walked away into the thinning crowd. Marlowe wrapped the wedding dress back into its tissue paper and placed it carefully at the bottom of the trunk. Around her, the last of the other merchants were packing up, the sounds of a long day settling into the quieter sounds of early evening, distant voices, the lowing of cattle in their pens. Somewhere in the direction of the main street, the sound of someone playing a fiddle, badly, with great enthusiasm. She was securing the trunk latches when she heard boots on the ground behind her and looked up to find Coulter Boone standing a few feet away. He had his hat in his hand, not because there was a specific reason to remove it, just as a gesture toward the end-of-day hour when people tended to relax the formal arrangements of the workday. "You're still here," he said. "You keep expecting me not to be," she said. "No," he said. "I keep being surprised by how much I'm not surprised." He looked at the trunk. "Good day?" "Fair day. I may have a serious inquiry on the wedding dress for tomorrow morning." He nodded. He stood with the particular quality of a person who isn't in a hurry and isn't performing not being in a hurry, which was its own kind of unusual. "Lenora Vance told 2 people this afternoon that she intends to have your registration pulled tomorrow," he said, "on the grounds that your table is presenting substandard goods that reflect poorly on the event." Marlowe's jaw tightened. She felt the anger move through her, quick and hot, and then she held it where it was, not letting it into her voice. "On what basis?" "On the basis that Lenora Vance wants what she wants," he said. "That's generally the only basis required around here." She looked at him. "Can she actually do that?" "The event is run by the Merchants Association, which has a 3-member board." He paused. 2 of the 3 members have loans from Garvey's Bank. Garvey's Bank has a standing arrangement with the Vance operation. He let that sit for a moment. "So, technically, it requires a board vote. Practically, I see. I thought you should know tonight," he said, "rather than finding out in the morning when there's less time to think about it." She looked at the trunk. She thought about Catherine Rourke and her daughter getting married in September. She thought about the roof in Sulphur Creek and the brackish well and Grover's shoes. "What time does the board convene in the morning?" she asked. He looked at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that was almost a smile. 8. At the hotel. And where does the Merchants Association register its complaints and objections? Same place, same time. He paused. Written objections are accepted. So is testimony. She looked up at him. Would you testify to the quality of the work as someone who does commodity assessment professionally? He held her gaze. Yes, he said, without hesitation, without qualification. She nodded slowly. I'll need paper, she said, and a lamp. Hotel front desk will sell you paper. They keep lamp oil in the rooms. He put his hat back on. I know the man who runs the livestock pen. He'll let you keep your wagon and mule overnight on the grounds at no charge. You arranged that already? I asked him to make the offer available, he said carefully. Whether you took it was up to you. She looked at him for a long moment. He was a stranger. She had known him for about 8 hours. Everything she'd observed about him in that time suggested a person who kept his own counsel and didn't extend himself unnecessarily, which made the extending, when it happened, more rather than less significant. Thank you, she said, not perfunctorily, actually meaning it. I'll meet you at the hotel at 7:30, he said, if you want company going in. I'll manage on my own, she said, the same thing she'd said that afternoon. I know, he said, the same way he'd said it. Offer stands. He walked away in the direction of the cattle pens. Marlowe stood by her trunk in the settling dusk of the Red Hollow cattle and trade auction grounds, the sounds of the evening moving around her. Fiddle music, distant conversation, the ordinary sounds of a town doing what towns do. And she thought about the satchel inside the wagon. The satchel she'd almost left behind in Sulphur Creek because she hadn't been sure it was relevant. Her mother had repaired clothing for a lot of people. Rich people, poor people, everyone in between. People talked while their clothes were being fitted. They said things they didn't remember saying, and her mother, who was quiet and thorough and kept her eyes and ears as careful as her needle, had written some of those things down. Not everything, just the things that seemed later like they might matter. Marlowe had read those pages on the road. She had her mother's handwriting in her own satchel, and she had spent 11 days on the road from Sulphur Creek thinking about what to do with it. She hadn't come to Red Hollow looking for a fight, but she was beginning to think that one might find her anyway. She secured the trunk, covered it with the canvas tarp, and walked toward the hotel with the last of the day's orange light on her back. But the fiddle player in the direction of the main street hit a wrong note and then kept going, which was probably the right decision. Some things you just had to play through. The hotel lobby smelled like pipe smoke and old wood and something that might have been beef stew from whatever the kitchen had going. And the man behind the front desk looked at Marlowe the way people look at someone who has arrived at an inconvenient hour with an inconvenient request. She bought 3 sheets of paper for a penny, which she considered highway robbery but paid without comment. And the man assigned her a room on the second floor that was small and had a window that looked out over the alley rather than the main street, which suited her fine. She didn't need a view. She needed a lamp and a flat surface and a few hours of quiet. She got Grover settled first. The man at the livestock pen, a short, barrel-chested fellow named Ott, who smelled powerfully of horses and seemed to have no opinion about anything except the quality of various animal feed, showed her where to put the wagon and pointed at the water trough without a lot of conversation, which she appreciated. She gave Grover his grain, checked his feed out of habit, told him she'd be back in the morning, and went to her room. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a moment before she opened the satchel. It was her mother's handwriting. That was the thing she kept bumping into. Not the content, which she'd read twice on the road and had committed to a reasonable approximation of memory, but the handwriting itself. Her mother had written in a small, careful hand, the letters slightly compressed the way they get when someone is trying to say a lot on a limited amount of paper. Reading it felt like hearing a voice from a room 2 doors down, present enough to be real, distant enough to hurt. She set that feeling aside. It was real, and it would be there later. Right now she had practical work to do. The notes covered 6 pages, written on the backs of old pattern sheets. Her mother's habit of using whatever flat surface was available. They weren't organized in any way that suggested her mother had anticipated someone else reading them. They were more like the kind of notes a person makes for themselves, shorthand observations that assumed a certain amount of shared context. Marlowe had spent a good portion of those 11 road days filling in the context from her own memory. There was a name, Hargrove Vance, and a date from 3 years ago, and a description of a conversation her mother had overheard while fitting a dress for a woman named Agnes Polly, whose husband worked as a clerk at Garvey's bank. Agnes Polly had been the kind of woman who talked while she was being fitted because the silence made her nervous, and she had talked about her husband's work in the vague, half-coded way of someone who knew she shouldn't be specific but couldn't help being a little specific anyway. The content of what she'd said, assembled carefully by Marlowe's mother into something approaching coherence, described a document, a contract, that had been amended after signing. The amendment was not minor. It changed the collateral terms on a loan taken by a homesteader named Birch, such that land Birch had explicitly excluded from the collateral arrangement became included without his knowledge or signature. That was one family. Marlowe had reason to believe it wasn't the only one. She wrote carefully and slowly because she only had 3 sheets of paper and she didn't want to waste any of it. She wrote out a formal objection to the proposed removal of her registration, citing the professional quality of her goods and requesting that a proper assessment be made. She wrote it in the plain, direct language her mother had always used when dealing with institutions. No flourishes, no apologies, no hedging, just the facts and the request. Then she wrote a second document. This one was shorter. It stated that she possessed written records in the hand of her late mother, Martha Pierce, formerly of Sulphur Creek, pertaining to certain business arrangements conducted through Garvey's commercial bank between the years of 1879 and 1882. That she was willing to make these records available to the appropriate parties, that she was present in Red Hollow for the next 24 hours and could be reached through the hotel. She didn't address it to anyone specific. She left that line blank for now. She blew out the lamp and lay down on the narrow bed without undressing, staring at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the sounds of Red Hollow settling into its night version of itself. The muffled music from the saloon 2 streets over, a dog barking somewhere, the occasional voice from the street below. She was not, she told herself, afraid. She was aware of risk. Those were different things, and her mother had been very clear on the distinction. What she was, underneath the practical thinking and the careful writing and the management of the fear she wasn't calling fear, was tired. The kind of tired that 11 days on the road will put into your bones, compounded by a day of standing and smiling and holding her ground and calculating. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time and not putting it down even when you could. She thought about the wedding dress in the trunk in the wagon, about the woman who had ordered it and never come back, about her mother finishing it anyway, unable to leave a thing undone. She fell asleep before she'd decided what she thought about any of it. She was at the hotel dining room at 6:30, eating eggs and cornbread that were both acceptable without being remarkable, when Catherine Rourke came in. The older woman spotted her immediately and came directly to her table with the focused efficiency of someone who doesn't have patience for the performance of coincidence. "I heard about the board meeting," Catherine said, pulling out the chair across from Marlowe without asking, which Marlowe didn't mind. Sit-down breakfast conversations was not how she would have described it, but the chair was there and the information was apparently urgent. "Word travels fast," Marlowe said. "Red Hollow is a small town wearing a medium town's hat," Catherine signaled to the woman behind the counter for coffee. "Lenora Vance sent her man to each of the 3 board members last night. I know because my neighbor's boy does odd jobs for one of them, and he was there when the man came." She looked at Marlowe directly. "Are you going to fight it?" "I'm going to the meeting at 8, Marlowe said. "I have a written objection." "That's something." Catherine accepted her coffee and wrapped her hands around the cup. "It may not be enough. Caldwell and Whitmore, 2 of the 3 board members, they have reasons to stay friendly with the Vances." "I know," Marlowe said. "Coulter Boone explained some of it." Catherine looked at her. Something shifted in her expression, a reassessment, or maybe just an additional piece of information being filed away. "Coulter Boone explained it to you. He offered information. I'm not sure what his interest is." "Coulter's interest in things is usually harder to read than it looks," Catherine said. "But when he decides something is worth his attention, he doesn't do things halfway." She drank her coffee. "My daughter's name is Ruth. She's 23 and she's marrying a good man named Aldous Finch who farms 12 miles north of here. I want her to have something beautiful to wear when she does." She set down the cup. "I'll be at the board meeting at 8. Marlowe looked at her. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," Catherine said, with a quality of mild impatience that suggested she was accustomed to people telling her what she didn't have to do. I want Ruth's dress to still be available at noon. Those are related facts. The board won't care about one customer. I'm not planning to go as one customer, Catherine said. I know 4 other women who bought from this row last year and weren't happy about a decision the board made regarding a fabric merchant they also pressured out. They've been waiting for a reason to say so formally. She paused. I'll make some visits before 8. Marlowe sat with that for a moment. There was something disorienting about receiving help from a near stranger. Not the help itself, but the way it arrived without her having asked for it, without conditions being named, without a ledger being opened. Her instinct was to wonder what Catherine Rourke wanted from the arrangement, and her secondary instinct, which she trusted a little more, said that sometimes people just decided something was worth doing and did it. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me until we see how the meeting goes, Catherine said. She pushed back her chair. I'll be there at 5 to 8. Don't be late. She left without finishing her coffee. Marlowe ate the rest of her eggs, which had gone slightly cold, and thought about the second document in her satchel, the one with the blank address line. She had written it in the night without being entirely sure she was going to use it. It was a significant step. What she held in her mother's notes was not conclusive proof of anything. It was a second-hand account from a woman who had been talking obliquely about her husband's work while having a dress fitted, which was not the same as a signed affidavit, but it was a thread. And threads, pulled at the right time and in the right direction, had a way of doing more than they looked like they should. The question was whether this was the right time, whether she was in a position to pull it, or whether it would pull her instead. She was still thinking about this when Coulter Boone appeared in the doorway of the dining room. He spotted her, crossed to the table, sat down in the chair Catherine Rourke had just vacated, and said without preamble, "There's a complication." "Of course there is," Marlowe said. "The third board member, Hess, the one without the bank arrangement. He's apparently willing to vote in your favor, but he came to me last night and said he wants to know what your situation actually is before he puts his name on anything." He looked at her steadily. "He's heard that you've got something in that satchel. Not what it is, just that you've got something. Someone talked." She felt the cold move through her quickly, then settle. "Who?" "I don't know. Could be someone who saw you writing last night. The lamp was on late. Hotel walls are thin. Could be Ott at the pen said something about your wagon being heavier than you'd expect for a seamstress." He shrugged one shoulder. "Doesn't much matter how. What matters is that Hess wants to know if you're bringing something bigger to this than a registration dispute." She looked at him. He met her eyes without flinching or pressing. "Are you asking me that too?" she said. "I'm telling you what Hess said," he said. "What you tell him is your business." "If I tell him I have evidence of fraud in Garvey's bank dealings," she said, keeping her voice low and level, "I'm not just fighting a registration dispute anymore." "No," he agreed. "You're not. The notes I have aren't conclusive. They're my mother's handwriting, second-hand accounts. A good lawyer would tear them apart." "A good lawyer would," he said. "But Hess isn't a lawyer, and neither are the other board members, and neither are most of the people who would hear about it if it came out in a public meeting." He paused. "Sometimes a thread doesn't need to be a rope to do what you need it to do." She looked at him for a long moment. He was saying, without saying it directly, exactly what she'd been thinking in the night, which was either reassuring or alarming, and she wasn't entirely sure which. "Why are you doing this?" she said. Not accusatory, just the question, direct. He didn't answer immediately. He picked up her empty coffee cup, looked at it, set it back down. "I've watched the Vance operation absorb 7 properties in 8 years, he said. "I do assessment work in this valley. I know what those properties were worth and what the families who held them had built. I know what the terms of those loans looked like." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't say anything because it wasn't my fight, and because I calculated, the way you calculate these things, that what I had wasn't enough to matter. My boss. And now?" He looked at her. "Now there's a woman who wrote 11 days to sell her dead mother's dresses, and she's holding something in that satchel, and she's the only person in 6 years who hasn't decided that the trouble isn't worth it." He said it flatly, without drama. "That changes the calculation." She sat with that. It was not a comfortable thing to sit with. Being someone else's reason, being the variable that tips the balance, was its own kind of weight. But she understood it. She had her own version of the same calculation. "I'll talk to Hess," she said. "Before 8. Coulter nodded. He pushed back his chair, then stopped. "One more thing. Lenora knows something is happening. Her man was at the hotel early this morning. She's going to be at that meeting herself." Marlowe absorbed this. "All right." "She's going to try to make it about you personally. Your appearance, your background, your right to be here. She does that when she doesn't have a legal angle. She makes it social, and she's good at it." "I know," Marlowe said. "I watched her do it yesterday." "Yesterday you were a stranger she'd just met," he said. "Today she's had a night to think about you." She met his eyes. "So have I," she said. "Had a night to think." Something in his expression shifted. That almost smile again. "Fair point." He stood. "Hess is at the barber shop on the north end of Main Street. Gets a shave every morning at 7. He left. The dining room was filling up with the ordinary business of a morning, people coming in for breakfast, conversation moving around her at a normal volume. Marlowe sat in the middle of it for a moment, feeling the particular quality of a decision that has been made without you entirely noticing you were making it. She picked up her satchel, left 2 cents on the table for the coffee she'd drunk and the chair she'd used, and went to find a man named Hess at a barber shop on the north end of Main Street. Hess was 60, or close to it. A compact man with the kind of sun-damaged face that comes from decades outdoors, currently covered in shaving soap from the ears down. The barber was a young man who stepped back politely when Marlowe came in and said she needed a word with Mr. Hess on a matter of some urgency. Hess looked at her from under the soap with the patient expression of a man who has learned that urgency comes for you whether you're ready or not. "The Pierce woman," he said. "Coulter said you might come." "I'd rather speak plainly than not," she said. "I prefer it," he said. "Talk while he finishes. I've got a meeting at 8. So she talked. She told him about the notes, what they contained and what they didn't contain, honestly and without embellishment. She told him what the limitations were. She told him she had a formal objection to the registration dispute that stood on its own merits, and that the other matter was separate, and that she was not trying to conflate them. Hess listened. The barber worked around the conversation with the focused indifference of a professional who has heard everything and is paid to hear nothing. When she finished, Hess was quiet for about 30 seconds. The barber wiped his face clean and stepped back. "The Birch property," Hess said finally. "That one bothered me when it happened. Birch was a careful man. He wouldn't have signed something with those terms." "No," Marlowe agreed. "He wouldn't have." Hess looked at her. His eyes were small and dark and extremely direct. "If you bring those notes out in the meeting this morning, Lenora Vance is going to come at you like a weather event. You understand that?" "Yes." "And you're still here." "I'm still here," she said. He made a sound in his chest. Not quite a laugh, not quite agreement, something between the two. He stood up and put on his hat. "I'll vote in favor of your registration on the merits," he said. "What else happens in that room is what happens." He looked at her one more time, the kind of look that is also an assessment. "Your mother wrote those notes down. Why?" Marlowe considered the question. She had her own answer to it, the one she'd been working on for 11 days of road. "Because she didn't know what else to do with something that was wrong," she said, "and she couldn't leave a thing undone." Hess put 2 cents on the barber's counter and walked out into the morning. Marlowe stood in the small barber shop for a moment, the smell of shaving soap and leather around her. The sounds of Red Hollow starting its day coming through the door Hess had left slightly open. She thought about her mother, about the pattern sheets with the careful handwriting, about the wedding dress in the trunk, finished because it couldn't be left unfinished. Then she straightened her satchel on her shoulder and walked out into the street toward the hotel, where at 8 o'clock a 3-member board was going to decide whether she had the right to stand in the same space as everyone else and sell what she had made. She had 7 minutes. She walked fast. The hotel's back meeting room was not designed for drama. It was a plain rectangle with 4 wooden chairs behind a table and maybe 15 feet of floor space in front of it, the kind of room that existed to host small disputes about fence lines and unpaid invoices and the occasional argument about noise ordinances. The wallpaper was brown. The single window faced east, which meant the morning light came in flat and unforgiving, and there was nowhere to stand in that room where you looked particularly good. Marlowe got there at 2 minutes to 8. Catherine Rourke was already there, standing against the left wall with 4 other women Marlowe didn't recognize. They ranged in age from maybe 30 to maybe 60, and they all had the particular quality of people who have decided something and are waiting for the moment to say so. Catherine gave Marlowe a brief nod that communicated several things simultaneously. I did what I said I'd do. The rest is up to the room. Stand straight. Coulter was there too, positioned near the back wall with his arms crossed and his hat on, which was unusual for indoors. He caught her eye and said nothing. The three board members sat behind the table. Caldwell was on the left, a heavy-set man with a good suit and the permanent expression of someone trying to appear more comfortable than he was. Whitmore was on the right, thinner, with ink-stained fingers that suggested he did his own bookkeeping and possibly resented it. Hess sat in the middle, his freshly shaved face composed and unreadable, giving nothing away about the conversation they'd had 20 minutes ago in the barber shop. Lenora Vance arrived at exactly 8 o'clock, which Marlowe noted was either punctuality or theater, and was probably both. She brought 2 people with her, one of her women from yesterday, and a man in a lawyer's suit who carried a leather folder and said nothing, just positioned himself at Lenora's right shoulder like an expensive piece of furniture. The room was suddenly very full for its size. Caldwell cleared his throat. This is a review of registration status for table number 37, held by a Miss Marlowe Pierce of Sulphur Creek. He looked at his paper. The complaint was filed by Mrs. Lenora Vance, who alleges that the goods presented at table 37 are of insufficient quality to represent the standards of the Red Hollow Cattle and Trade Auction. He looked up. Mrs. Vance, you want to state your complaint for the record? Lenora stepped forward. She had dressed very carefully for this meeting. Not the green silk of yesterday, which would have read as ostentatious for a morning proceeding, but a composed dark blue that communicated seriousness and authority without trying too hard. She was good at this. Marlowe could see exactly how good she was, watching her arrange her expression into something that managed to convey both concern and regret, as though this whole business pained her personally. Gentlemen, she said, and her voice had the measured warmth of someone who has practiced measured warmth until it comes naturally. I raise this concern not out of any personal objection to Miss Pierce, but out of regard for this event's reputation, which all of us have worked to build over many years. She paused for exactly the right length of time. The goods at that table are poorly finished, inconsistent in quality, and frankly not appropriate for a venue of this standing. I speak as someone who has an eye for these matters. That's false, Marlowe said. The room shifted. Lenora turned to look at her with an expression of mild surprise that was entirely performed. Miss Pierce, Caldwell said, you'll have your turn to... She stated a factual claim, Marlowe said, keeping her voice level, that the goods are poorly finished and inconsistent. That's a factual claim that can be assessed. I'm asking that it be assessed before it's accepted. Caldwell looked at Whitmore. Whitmore looked at Hess. Hess said, that's a reasonable request. Lenora's lawyer cleared his throat softly, which was apparently a signal of some kind because Lenora shifted her approach without visible pause, the way experienced people redirect when one road closes. The quality of the goods is almost secondary, she said smoothly. What concerns me more is the character of the presentation. The table registration was obtained under circumstances that suggest... The registration was obtained for 2 cents, Marlowe said. Same as every other table. The registration man can confirm the transaction was completed correctly. Miss Pierce, Caldwell's voice had an edge now. If you interrupt again before you're addressed, I will ask you to wait outside. She closed her mouth. She was right, and she was pushing too hard, and she knew it. Coulter, from his position at the back wall, was looking at a point approximately 2 feet above her head, which she interpreted as a very restrained signal to dial it back. Lenore continued. She made her case with the smooth efficiency of someone who has made versions of this case before, in this room or rooms like it. The vague appeals to standards, the careful insinuations about propriety, the strategic use of the word community, as in what's best for our community, which in this context meant what's best for the people whose opinion Lenora Vance cared about, which was a much smaller group than the word implied. When Caldwell turned to Marlowe and said, Miss Pierce, your response, she had used the listening time to get her breathing even and her thoughts in order. She opened her satchel and placed the written objection on the board's table. I've written a formal response for the record, she said. The short version is this. I have sold 6 pieces since yesterday morning, All completed transactions, no complaints. I have a pending serious inquiry on a seventh piece for this morning. Two of the women standing against that wall purchased goods from other tables last year and are prepared to attest that the standard for goods at this event has never been formally defined or enforced prior to this complaint. Catherine against the wall said clearly, "That's correct." One of the other women said, "Same." Lenora's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A slight recalculation, a recognition that the room was not arranged the way she'd expected it to be. Whitmore was looking at the written objection. He had the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who is holding two obligations that are pulling in different directions and is hoping someone else will resolve the tension for him. "The objection is formally submitted," he said, mostly to give himself something to say. "There's a second matter," Hess said. The room looked at him. He said it with such complete absence of drama that it was almost more alarming than if he'd announced it loudly. "Miss Pierce has indicated that she is in possession of records pertaining to certain loan arrangements conducted through this area's commercial banking institution over the past several years." He looked at Marlowe. "Is that correct?" The room went very quiet. A different kind of quiet than before. Not the quiet of people waiting for a proceeding to continue, but the quiet of a room that has just understood that the proceeding has changed shape. Lenora turned to look at Marlowe. Her expression had shifted entirely. The warm authority was gone. What replaced it was something harder and more honest, a direct assessment, the kind she had probably not used since the last time something had genuinely threatened her. "What records?" she said. Not a question. A demand. "My mother repaired clothing for a number of families in this valley over many years," Marlowe said. She kept her voice even. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which was faster than she wanted it to be, but her hands were still. "People talk while they're being fitted. My mother wrote down the things that seemed like they might matter." "That is hearsay," Lenora's lawyer said, his first words in the proceeding, delivered with the flat professional authority of someone who is paid to produce that quality of authority on demand. "It may be," Marlowe said. "That's for people with more legal expertise than I have to determine." She looked at Hess. "I'm not presenting it as legal evidence. I'm stating that I have it, that I'm aware of what it suggests, and that I'm in Red Hollow for one more day and available to speak with anyone who wants to know more about it." Lenora was very still. It was a different stillness than Marlowe's own. Not the stillness of someone holding something back, but the stillness of a person rapidly running through possibilities and not finding the one she wanted. "You're bluffing," Lenora said. "Ask the Birch family," Marlowe said. The name landed in the room like a stone into still water. The ripples were immediate and visible. Caldwell's face did something complicated. Whitmore set down the written objection. Hess looked straight ahead at nothing in particular. Even Lenora's lawyer shifted his weight slightly, which from a man of his professional composure was equivalent to a significant reaction. Lenora said, very quietly, "Who sent you here?" "Nobody sent me," Marlowe said. "I came to sell my mother's dresses." The silence ran for several seconds, long enough to be uncomfortable for most of the people in the room. Marlowe endured it. Then Coulter spoke from the back wall for the first time since the meeting started. "I move that the board vote on the registration dispute," he said, "on the merits." "Coulter Boone doesn't have standing to move anything in this proceeding," the lawyer said. "I'm a registered attendee of this auction with a financial interest in goods assessed at table 37, Coulter said, with the same flat quality. "I believe that gives me standing as an interested party." Hess looked at him. Something passed between them that Marlowe couldn't entirely read. The recognition of two people who have been in the same town for several years without being enemies or allies, and who are now, in this specific room, on the same side of something. "The motion is seconded," Hess said. "Board votes on the merits of the registration complaint." Caldwell's jaw worked. He looked at Lenora. Whatever he was looking for in her expression, permission, guidance, a signal. He didn't seem to find it clearly because she was still fixed on Marlowe with that hard, calculating look and was not attending to Caldwell at all. "All in favor of upholding the registration of Table 37, Hess said, "on the grounds that no formal standard has been violated." Hess said, "Aye." After a pause that lasted about 4 full seconds, Whitmore said, "Aye," in the voice of a man stepping off a ledge and hoping the ground isn't as far down as it looks. Caldwell said nothing, which wasn't a yes, but it also wasn't enough of a no to matter. Registration is upheld, Hess said. Meeting adjourned. The room broke apart in the way rooms do when a formal proceeding ends. Not all at once, but in small clusters, people turning to each other with the lowered voices and the sidelong glances of people who are processing something. Catherine Rourke put her hand briefly on Marlowe's arm, a quick, firm pressure that said several things, and said none of them out loud. Lenora Vance did not leave immediately. She stood in the center of the room while her companions and her lawyer formed a loose cluster around her, and she looked at Marlowe with the expression of someone who has just recalculated a situation and found the new numbers unacceptable. She wasn't finished. Marlowe could see that with complete clarity. This morning was a round, not the fight. That name you dropped, Lenore said, quietly enough that it was just between the two of them in the general noise of the dispersing room. You can't prove anything with hearsay from a dead woman. Maybe not, Marlowe said. But the Birch family is still in the valley, and Agnes Pauly's husband still keeps records. And people in this town have been waiting for a reason to ask questions out loud. She paused. I'm not your enemy, Mrs. Vance. I came here to sell dresses. Then sell your dresses, Lenore said, and go home. She walked out. Her lawyer followed. The woman from yesterday followed the lawyer. The room was suddenly quieter and about half the size it had been when they were in it. Coulter came to stand beside Marlowe. He didn't say anything immediately, just stood there with his hat still on, looking at the door through which Lenora had left. That went better than it could have, he said finally. It went worse than I hoped, she said. That's usually how these things go. He glanced at her sideways. She's not going to let this sit. I know. The name you dropped, the Birches. Do you actually know where they are? Marlowe picked up her satchel from the floor where she'd set it during the meeting. My mother's notes mention a woman named Helen Birch, who used to bring mending from a homestead 30 miles north. There's an address. She paused. I don't know if they're still there. The Birch property was absorbed 4 years ago, Coulter said. But I know where Emmett Birch went after. He's working a ranch about 20 miles east. His wife is with her sister in town. She comes to Red Hollow once a month. He looked at her. I can find out if she's here this week. Marlowe looked at him. She was aware, again, of the strangeness of trusting someone she had known for less than 24 hours. She was also aware that trust was built from observation, and everything she had observed about this man was consistent in the ways that mattered. He didn't promise things he didn't deliver. He didn't tell her things were going to be fine when they weren't. He showed up when he said he was going to. Yes, she said. Find out. He nodded. He moved toward the door, then stopped. He turned back and looked at her with that direct, slightly too observant gaze. You knew the name Birch was going to land the way it did, he said. You knew before you said it. It wasn't quite a question. My mother wrote it down, she said. She wrote down everything she thought might matter. I trust her judgment. He stood there for a moment. Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully name. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't admiration exactly. It was something more complicated than either. The look of a person encountering grief and courage so tangled together they can't be separated. She sounds like she was something, he said. She was, Marlowe said. She really was. He left. She stood alone in the plain brown room with the flat east light coming through the single window, and she let herself have 30 seconds of just standing there with the weight of the morning pressing on her from all directions. The fear she wasn't calling fear. The grief she'd set aside for practical work. The exhaustion that 11 days of road and one very long meeting had put into her shoulders and her feet. 30 seconds. Then she straightened her satchel and walked back out through the hotel lobby and into the Red Hollow morning, where her table was waiting on the merchant's row, and Catherine Rourke's daughter Ruth was coming at 9 o'clock to see a wedding dress that a woman had finished because she couldn't leave a thing undone. The auction grounds were filling up again. A normal morning from the outside. The cattle noise from the far end, the merchants setting out their goods, children running in the dust. A man selling leather goods at the table next to hers gave her a nod when she arrived. The kind of nod that means I saw what happened this morning and I'm not going to say anything about it directly, but here's the nod. She returned it. She opened her trunk, spread the blue wool cloth, and began the careful work of laying out what remained. Ruth Rourke had come at 9 o'clock as promised. With her mother and with the particular nervous energy of a young woman who has been told something beautiful exists and is not yet sure she's allowed to want it. She was 23, slight, with her mother's directness and her own version of it, less weathered, more uncertain, the same quality of attention in her eyes, but still learning what to do with it. She looked at the wedding dress for a long time without touching it, and then she looked at Marlowe and said, "My mother said your mother made this without knowing if anyone would ever wear it." "That's right," Marlowe said. Ruth was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I want to wear it." The transaction took longer than it should have because Ruth kept finding new details to look at. The needle-tatted lace, the hidden seam along the left side that gave the skirt its particular fall, the way the ivory held the morning light. Catherine paid without flinching at the number, which told Marlowe something about what the dress was worth to them beyond the money. They left with it wrapped carefully in the tissue paper, Ruth carrying it with both arms like something that might dissolve if she wasn't careful. Marlowe watched them go and felt the complicated satisfaction of a thing completed. Not just the sale, but the completion of something her mother had started. The dress was going to be worn in September, in front of people who mattered to the woman wearing it. That was the right ending for it. She didn't have long to sit with the feeling. By 10 o'clock, the day had moved on into its own complications. Coulter came back at 10:15 with a woman beside him. She was maybe 45, thin in the way of someone who had worked hard for a long time, with reddish hair going to gray and eyes that had the particular watchfulness of someone who had learned to assess situations quickly and accurately because the cost of getting it wrong had been high. She walked with a slight stiffness in her left hip that suggested an old injury, and she carried herself with the upright quality of a person who has had things taken from them and made a conscious decision not to let that also take their posture. "This is Helen Birch," Coulter said. Helen Birch looked at Marlowe the way people look at someone they've heard about and are determining whether the account was accurate. "Coulter says you have your mother's notes," she said. "No preamble, no small talk. Straight to it." "I do," Marlowe said. "Martha Pierce, from Sulphur Creek." Helen said the name slowly. "She repaired my husband's good coat 3 years ago, about 2 months before we lost the property. Emmett wore that coat to every meeting with Garvey." She paused. "Did she write anything about those meetings?" "She wrote what you told her while she was fitting the coat," Marlowe said carefully. "She didn't write about the meetings themselves. She wasn't there." "What did I tell her?" Marlowe reached into the satchel and found the right page. She'd marked it with a folded corner on the road. She read it aloud. Her mother's careful, compressed handwriting turned back into spoken words. It was not long, and it was not dramatic, and it was also not nothing. It described, in Helen Birch's own words as transcribed by Martha Pierce, the moment Helen had realized something was wrong with the loan documents, a conversation with her husband, where he'd shown her the signature page and said the collateral section looked different from what he remembered initially. It described Emmett Birch going back to Garvey's office and being told he was misremembering, that the document was exactly what he'd signed, that frontier air made men confused about details. When Marlowe finished reading, Helen was quiet for a moment. Her jaw was tight. "I said all that to a seamstress while she was fixing a coat," she said. "You said it," Marlowe said. "She wrote it down." "Why?" "Because she thought it might matter someday." Marlowe folded the page back carefully. "She wrote down things she thought might matter. She didn't know when or how. She just kept the notes." Helen looked away at the middle distance of the auction grounds, where normal commerce was continuing in the ordinary noises of a summer day. She was doing something with her face that was the effort of not doing something with her face. After a moment, she said, "We had that property for 11 years. Emmett built the house himself. We had a daughter born in that house." She stopped. She was not going to cry in public. Marlowe could see that. It was a decision she'd made and was maintaining by force. "Garvey told us we'd misread the documents. The lawyer the court appointed to review it said the same thing. We couldn't afford our own lawyer. We couldn't afford to fight it." She looked back at Marlowe. "You can't prove anything with my words written down by someone who's dead." "Not by itself," Marlowe said. "But you're not the only one. I think there are others." "There are others," Coulter said. He had been standing slightly back from the conversation, giving it room, but his voice was certain when he said it. "I know of 2 more families. I've been thinking about this for 3 years and not doing anything about it because I didn't have a thread to pull." He looked at Marlowe. "Now there's a thread." Helen looked at him. She looked at Marlowe. The assessment was direct and not brief. She was doing the calculation that people do when they're considering whether to trust something that could cost them, and she was doing it honestly, without pretending it was simpler than it was. "What do you need from me?" she said finally. "Your account," Marlowe said. "In your own words, written and signed. What you told my mother, but this time formal. What you remember about the loan documents, about the discrepancy Emmett noticed, about the conversation with Garvey. That's not legal testimony." "Not yet," Marlowe said. "But it's a record that exists, and records have a way of becoming relevant when enough of them accumulate." Helen was quiet again. A group of people moved past the table, glancing at the remaining garments, moving on. The leather goods man at the next table was haggling with a customer over the price of a belt, the ordinary world conducting its ordinary business around the edges of this conversation. "If I do this," Helen said, "and it goes nowhere, if Garvey and Vance just bury it the way they buried everything else, then I've put myself in their sight line for nothing. They've got long memories." "Yes," Marlowe said. She didn't soften it. "That's the risk." Helen looked at her. "You're not going to tell me it'll be fine." "I don't know if it'll be fine." Something shifted in Helen's expression. It might have been respect, or it might have been the bleak recognition of honesty after a long time of people telling her comfortable things that turned out not to be true. Either way, she straightened her spine another fraction of an inch. "Get me paper," she said. Marlowe had one remaining sheet from the 3 she'd bought the night before. She gave it to Helen along with the pencil from her satchel, and Helen Birch sat down on the edge of the trunk and wrote in a hand that was less careful than Martha Pierce's but entirely legible, the account of what she remembered, signed at the bottom with her full name and the date. While Helen was writing, Coulter leaned slightly toward Marlowe and said quietly, "Lenora's man has been walking the grounds all morning." Marlowe had noticed. She'd been aware of him since about 9:30. A large, square-faced man in a brown vest who moved through the auction grounds with the particular air of someone who is not shopping. He'd passed her table twice, both times at the far edge of the row. Not stopping, just moving past with that casually observant quality that announced surveillance to anyone who'd ever been watched before. "What's his name?" she said. "Dillard. He manages the Vance Ranch operation, does other things when asked." Coulter's voice was neutral in the way of someone making a fact available without editorializing. "He's not a violent man by inclination, but he does what he's told." "What might he be told to do?" "I don't know, that's what concerns me." He glanced in the direction Dillard had gone. "Lenora's been in the hotel since the meeting. She's had 2 visitors, Garvey, and one of the men from the town council. They were there about 40 minutes combined." "You've been watching the hotel." "I've been watching several things," he said. "It's what I do." Helen finished writing. She stood up, her left hip giving her a moment of visible trouble that she didn't remark on, and handed the paper back to Marlowe. "There's a family called the Ortegas," she said, 15 miles south. They lost their property 2 years after we did. Emilio Ortega will talk to you if Coulter vouches for the introduction." She looked at Coulter. "Will you?" "Yes," Coulter said. Helen nodded. She looked at Marlowe one more time, that same direct, unwasted gaze. "Your mother kept those notes for years," she said. "She never said anything to you about them?" "She mentioned them once," Marlowe said, "when she was very sick, near the end. She said she had some papers that might matter to some people. She said I'd know what to do with them when the time came." She paused. "I wasn't sure she was right about that." "She was right," Helen said. And then she walked away through the auction grounds with her slightly stiff gait and her upright spine, and Marlowe watched her go and felt the weight of the thing she was holding shift in a way that was hard to describe. It had been her mother's weight and her mother's purpose, and now it was becoming something shared, something distributed across more than one set of shoulders, which made it simultaneously heavier in its significance and lighter in the carrying. The morning moved toward noon. 2 more pieces sold from the table. One of the men's shirts to a rancher who spent exactly 30 seconds examining it before asking the price, which was the behavior of someone who knew quality on sight and was only checking the number out of formality. The second-day dress to a woman about Marlowe's age who tried it against herself, looked down, and said simply, "Yes." And that was the whole negotiation. It was during the quiet stretch after noon, when the heat had persuaded most people to find shade, that Dillard stopped at her table. He didn't pretend to look at the remaining garments. He just stood at the edge of the table and looked at Marlowe with the uncomplicated directness of a man who has been sent to deliver a message and intends to deliver it efficiently. "Mrs. Vance would like a word," he said. Marlowe looked at him. He was large in the way of a man who had been large his whole life and had learned to inhabit it as a kind of ambient information. "I am large, you are aware of this. Let us proceed accordingly." His face was not unkind, exactly, but it was not particularly interested in being kind either. He was a man doing a job. "Where?" Marlowe said. "Hotel, private dining room. She says 20 minutes of your time and then you can do whatever you like." He paused. "She said to tell you she's asking, not requiring." Marlowe was quiet for a moment. The distinction Dillard had been instructed to convey, asking, not requiring, was interesting. It meant Lenora had thought about how this approach would land. It meant she was adjusting. "All right," Marlowe said, Give me a few minutes to arrange for someone to watch the table." Dillard waited, which was its own kind of pressure, but she ignored that and went to find the leather goods man next door, who agreed to keep an eye on things for the price of one of the remaining shirts, which she agreed to, which meant she was selling it below asking price. But she calculated it was worth it. She told Coulter, who was somewhere nearby in the way he'd been somewhere nearby all morning. He appeared when she looked for him, which was both useful and slightly disconcerting. "Don't go alone," he said. "She said 20 minutes in a private dining room, in a hotel with people in it." "I know what she said." He looked at her. "I'm not saying she'll do anything there. I'm saying I'd like to know what's said." He paused. "I can be in the room next to it. The walls are thin." "I know they're thin," Marlowe said. "I was writing at a lamp last night and someone knew about it by morning." He accepted this without visible discomfort. "I'll be in the corridor then, within earshot if the door's not completely sealed." She wanted to tell him it wasn't necessary, that she was capable of walking into a hotel and having a conversation with a woman she didn't like without a guardian in the hallway. Both of those things were true. It was also true that she was about to sit across a table from someone who had been systematically dismantling people's lives for 8 years, and that Coulter Boone being in the corridor was not the same thing as being incapable. "Fine," she said. The hotel's private dining room was smaller than the meeting room from that morning. 4 chairs, a round table, a sideboard with a water pitcher. Lenora was already there, seated, with her hands folded on the table, in the way of a person who has decided what posture to present and is maintaining it consciously. She was not wearing the lawyer today. She was alone. This, Marlowe noted, was either a gesture of good faith or a more sophisticated form of pressure. Possibly both. "Thank you for coming," Lenora said. Marlowe sat down. She didn't respond to the thanks, which was not rudeness, just an accurate assessment that the thanks was performative and didn't require acknowledgement. Lenora looked at her for a moment. Without the audience of yesterday or the formal structure of the morning, her face was different, still controlled, but differently controlled. The way a structure looks different when you remove the decorative elements and see what's actually holding it up. "You're not what I expected," Lenora said. "You didn't expect anything," Marlowe said. "You saw a woman in a patched dress and you made a decision." A pause. Something moved across Lenora's face. "Yes," she said. "I did." It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, which from this woman was probably close to the outer limit of what was available. "I'm not here to relitigate yesterday." "Then what are you here for?" Lenora unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table. "I'd like to know what's actually in those notes." "Why?" "Because I'd rather know than not know." She held Marlowe's gaze. "And because if there's something there that could cause serious harm, I'd rather have the conversation privately than publicly." Marlowe looked at her. She understood what was being offered. A negotiation conducted quietly in a room where no one else could hear the terms. The implicit suggestion was that there was something to negotiate about, that Lenora had things to offer that were worth more than a public spectacle. She also understood what accepting that framework would mean. It would mean agreeing that this was a private matter, that it could be resolved between the two of them without involving the Birches, the Ortegas, or anyone else whose property had been absorbed under those forged terms. "The notes describe a conversation," Marlowe said. "A woman told my mother that her husband noticed a discrepancy in loan documents, that the collateral section had been altered from what he'd originally agreed to." She paused. "That's what the notes say." Lenora was very still. One conversation. That I have written down, Marlowe said. There may be others. I don't know yet what I don't know. Lenora looked at her for a long moment. The calculation was visible, not the result, but the process, the weighing. What do you want? She said finally. I told you this morning. I came to sell my mother's dresses. Don't. Lenora's voice had an edge in it now, something real cutting through the managed surface. Don't tell me you don't want anything. Everyone wants something. You've been in this town for one day and you've already made yourself a significant problem for me. That doesn't happen by accident. Marlowe considered this. It was, in its way, a fair point. I want the families who lost their properties to be able to say what happened to them, she said, without being told they're misremembering. The silence in the room had a different quality than the morning silences. Smaller, more concentrated, like the stillness in a room just after a door has closed. That's not in my power to give you, Lenora said. I can't undo what's done. No, Marlowe agreed. But you can stop blocking the people who are still fighting it. The Ortegas are in arbitration right now about the southern boundary line. You have a man on the arbitration panel. She watched Lenora's face. I know because Helen Birch told me, and Helen Birch knows because her husband worked with Emilio Ortega before either of them lost their land. Lenora said nothing. Remove your man from the panel, Marlowe said. Let the arbitration proceed without interference, and I'll take my mother's notes back to Sulphur Creek, and we won't have this conversation again. It was not everything. She knew it was not everything. It was one arbitration, one family, not the 7 that had come before. She was not naive enough to think she could undo 8 years of careful maneuvering in a 20-minute hotel conversation. But it was something real, something specific, something that could be verified. Lenora looked at her for a long time. Long enough that the water pitcher on the sideboard became very interesting to the part of Marlowe's attention that wasn't focused on keeping her face neutral. You'd walk away, Lenora said. From everything else. I'm a seamstress from Sulphur Creek, Marlowe said. I'm not a crusader. I came to sell dresses. She paused. But I am my mother's daughter, and my mother kept those notes for a reason, and if I need to use them differently, I will. Another silence. Longer. The man on the panel is named Corrigan, Lenora said. He'll develop a scheduling conflict by end of week. She said it with the flat, effectless tone of someone dictating a business decision, not an admission of anything. That's what I can do. Marlowe held the line for another moment. She didn't trust this entirely. She wasn't built to trust it entirely, but she also recognized the sound of a real concession from a person who didn't make them often. The question was whether it was real or whether it was a delay. She thought about Helen Birch writing on the last piece of paper in careful, legible handwriting. About Emmett Birch going back to Garvey's office and being told he was misremembering. About her mother's compressed handwriting on the backs of pattern sheets, noting things that might matter without knowing when. By end of week, Marlowe said. And if he doesn't develop that conflict, what I have goes to the territorial newspaper in Meade County. They've been looking for something to write about that isn't cattle prices. Lenora absorbed this. You've thought this through. I've had 11 days on a very slow road, Marlowe said. I thought about a lot of things. For a moment, just a moment, brief enough that Marlowe wasn't entirely sure she'd seen it, something that was almost human crossed Lenora Vance's face. Not remorse, exactly. More like the recognition of being seen clearly by someone who had no reason to see her generously, and being seen anyway without distortion. It lasted about 2 seconds and then it was gone, submerged back under the managed surface. Lenora stood. Your table is still on the grounds, she said. I'll see that no further objections are raised. She left without another word. The door closed behind her. Marlowe sat alone in the small dining room for a moment. She was aware of the silence and also of her own heartbeat, which had been faster than she wanted through most of that conversation and was only now beginning to slow. She was also aware of a feeling she couldn't entirely name. Not triumph, because it wasn't that clean, and not relief, because the thing wasn't finished. Something more like the sensation of having carried a heavy object a long way and set it down in a place where it was still heavy but was at least resting on solid ground. She heard from the corridor the slight sound of someone shifting their weight. Coulter, keeping his word, present without intruding. She stood up, straightened her satchel, and walked out of the room. He was leaning against the wall 6 feet from the door. He looked at her face when she came out, a quick, thorough read. Corrigan's off the Ortega arbitration by end of week, she said. He was quiet for a moment. That's something. It's not everything, she said. No, he agreed. But it's a start. She looked at him. He was right, and she knew he was right, and she also knew that a start was a different thing from a finish, and that the distance between the two was not always crossable. But she went where the road went, and the road had brought her here, and she had done what she'd come to do, and more besides. I still have 2 garments on the table, she said, and half a day of auction left. He almost smiled. Then let's go sell some dresses. They walked back out into the red hollow afternoon together, not side by side in any deliberate or symbolic way, just 2 people walking in the same direction, because that was where they were both going, and the sun was high, and the auction grounds were full, and somewhere in the direction of the livestock pens Grover was probably eating his grain and having opinions about it, and the day was not finished yet. The last 2 garments sold before 3 o'clock. The remaining day dress went to a young woman who came to the table alone, without a companion or a mother or anyone to tell her what to think about it. She was maybe 20, with the look of someone who worked hard and didn't spend money on herself often enough to be comfortable doing it. She held the dress up, put it back, picked it up again, and stood there in the particular suspended state of a person fighting their own practical instincts. It'll last, Marlowe said. The seams are reinforced. The dye won't go in the wash. My mother built things to be used, not just looked at. The young woman bought it. She folded it herself carefully before Marlowe could do it for her, which said something about her that Marlowe liked. The last shirt sold 20 minutes later to the same rancher who'd bought the first one the previous day. He'd apparently gone home and told someone about it, because he came back with a list of measurements written on the back of a bill of sale and asked if Marlowe did commissions. She looked at him. She had not until that moment thought about commissions. She had thought about getting home, fixing the roof, dealing with the well, getting through the next season. She had thought about the 12 garments and what they would bring and whether it would be enough. She had not thought about what came after in any form that included continuing. I do, she said, because the words came out before the thinking caught up to them. And sometimes that was the more honest answer. He gave her the list of measurements and a deposit, which was more than she'd expected, and said he'd send the final payment to Sulphur Creek when she delivered. She wrote him a receipt on the last scrap of paper in her satchel. When he left, the table was empty. The blue wool cloth lay flat and bare in the afternoon sun. The trunk was considerably lighter than it had been when she'd loaded it 11 days ago in Sulphur Creek, which was the point, which was what success looked like. Not a dramatic moment, but an empty table and a satchel with more money in it than she'd started with. She sat down on the edge of the trunk and let herself be tired for a few minutes. Not the performed tiredness of someone making a point about how hard they'd worked, just the actual physical fact of 2 days of standing and negotiating and holding her ground and being afraid without calling it fear. The auction grounds were thinning around her as the 3rd day wound toward its close, the sounds of the place settling from their daytime volume into something quieter. The cattle noise from the far end had mostly stopped. The fiddle player from last night was tuning up somewhere in the direction of the saloon, still badly, still with great enthusiasm. Coulter came and stood at the edge of the table. He looked at the empty blue cloth and the empty trunk and said, "All of it." "All of it," she said. He nodded slowly. He had the expression of a man who is genuinely pleased about something and is not sure whether to show it. Your mother would know what to do with that. She'd say, "Don't spend it before you fix the roof," Marlowe said. He made a sound that was as close to a laugh as she'd heard from him. It changed his face, opened something in it that was usually held more carefully. She filed that away without thinking about why. "The Ortega arbitration," he said after a moment. "I'll check the panel composition at the end of the week. If Corrigan is still on it, then we have a conversation about what comes next," Marlowe said. "I know. I want you to know I'll do that regardless of whether you're in Red Hollow or Sulphur Creek." She looked at him. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Not the practiced quiet of someone choosing words carefully, but the genuine quiet of a person who is trying to say something true and is not entirely sure how to do it without it sounding like something else. "Because it's the right thing," he said finally, "and because I've been in this valley for 6 years watching things happen that I knew were wrong. And I kept calculating that it wasn't my fight, or that I didn't have enough to work with, or that the timing wasn't right." He paused. "Your mother kept notes for years and didn't know if they'd ever matter. She kept them anyway. He looked at Marlowe. I should have done more years ago. I didn't. I can do something now. She held his gaze. There was nothing comfortable about what he'd just said. It wasn't a flattering confession. It was an honest one, which was more valuable. He wasn't asking her to tell him it was fine. He was just saying it out loud to someone, maybe for the first time. All right, she said. Then you'll check at the end of the week. I'll send word to Sulphur Creek, he said. If you want it. I want it, she said. He nodded. He looked at the empty table one more time. When do you leave? Morning, she said. I want to get Grover rested tonight. 11 days back is a long road. It is, he agreed. He stood there for a moment in the way of a person who has more to say and is determining whether to say it. Then he said, For what it's worth, what you did in that room with Lenora Vance, most people would have taken a harder line or a softer one. You found the thing she could actually give you, and you took it. It might not hold, she said. She might put someone else on that panel. She might, he said, but she knows now that there's a record, that someone has it and is willing to use it. That changes the calculation, even if it doesn't change everything. He paused. Your mother made something with those notes. You finished it. Marlowe looked down at the empty blue cloth on the table. She thought about her mother at the kitchen table in Sulphur Creek, late at night, writing in that careful, compressed hand on the backs of old pattern sheets, not knowing what she was building, just writing down what seemed like it might matter, the way she sewed, with attention, with patience, with the conviction that the thing being made deserved to be made well, even if you couldn't see the finished shape yet. Help me fold this, she said, picking up one edge of the blue wool cloth. He picked up the other edge without comment, and they folded it between them the way you fold a large piece of cloth with two people, stepping toward each other, passing the folded edge, stepping back. It took about 4 folds. It was a completely ordinary thing to do at the end of a market day, and it was also, in some way she didn't try to articulate, the right note to end the afternoon on. Not dramatic, just the practical completion of a task, done together because it was easier that way. She put the cloth in the trunk, closed the latches, and stood up. I'll walk you to the pen, he said. I know where the pen is. I know you do, he said. Same as always, the offer standing regardless. Fine, she said. Same as always. They walked through the thinning auction grounds in the late afternoon light, and she noticed, not for the first time, but more clearly now, that several people they passed looked at her differently than they had when she'd arrived 2 mornings ago. Not all of them. Not the people who didn't know what had happened or didn't care, but some of them. The leather goods man gave her a nod that was several degrees warmer than the one he'd given her that morning. The woman who had bought the first shirt, the one with the work-roughened hands who'd said her mother knew what she was doing, was standing near the water trough and gave her a brief acknowledging look that communicated something without naming it. Hess, crossing the grounds in the direction of the hotel, stopped when he saw her and said, Safe road home, Miss Pierce, with the particular simplicity of a man who means what he says and doesn't add anything to it. Thank you, Mr. Hess, she said. It was not a transformation. She was not going to pretend it was a transformation. 2 days ago, she had walked into this town and been laughed at, and the people who were now nodding to her were the same people who had been in the crowd and had not laughed, but had also not said anything. The moral complexity of that was real, and she wasn't going to paper over it with the satisfying story of a town that had learned its lesson. Towns didn't learn lessons like people learned lessons. They shifted, gradually, when the balance of what was visible and acknowledged began to tip. But the shift was real, even if it was incomplete. And incomplete shifts were how complete changes eventually happened, if enough people kept pushing in the right direction. Grover was exactly where she'd left him, with exactly the level of interest in her arrival that she'd expected, which was minimal. He allowed her to check his feet and adjust his halter and give him the small piece of dried apple she'd been carrying in her coat pocket since Sulphur Creek, which he ate with the dignity of an animal who considers treats his natural due. Long day, she told him. He flicked one ear. Longer than I expected when we left. The other ear. We sold everything, she said, including the wedding dress. Grover swung his large head around and looked at her with one dark eye, which she chose to interpret as interested. She leaned her forehead briefly against the side of his neck, in the spot just below the jaw where the hair was shorter and softer. It was something she'd done since she was a child and had inherited the habit from her mother, who had claimed it was medically beneficial and probably hadn't meant it literally. It was just a way of being still for a moment with something large and uncomplicated that didn't have opinions about you. Coulter was leaning against the pen fence, giving her and the mule their moment, looking at the middle distance. After a while, she straightened up. "I need to write some things before tomorrow," she said. "I want to write to the territorial newspaper in Meade County. Not about what I told Lenora. I'll leave that alone for now, as long as Corrigan moves. But about the Ortega arbitration. About the pattern I observed in land acquisitions in this valley. Nothing that names sources directly. Just the shape of it, enough that someone who knows how to dig will know where to dig." Coulter looked at her. "That's a different kind of thread than what you said to Lenora." "I know," she said. "It doesn't violate what I told her. I said I wouldn't use what I have in the notes. I'm not. I'm writing about what is publicly observable if you know what you're looking at." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a man at the Meade County paper. His name is Aldridge. He's been wanting to write about land consolidation in frontier territories for 2 years and keeps getting told there's not enough evidence for a specific story." He paused. "He'd know what to do with the shape of it. Do you have an address?" He did. He recited it from memory, which told her he'd been thinking about this for longer than 2 days. She wrote it on the corner of the rancher's measurement list, which was the only paper she had left. They stood by the pen for a while longer. The evening was coming in now, the particular quality of light that happens in the last hour before sunset, when everything gets a little more golden and a little more definitive. The sounds of the auction grounds were almost entirely settled. The fiddle player had graduated from tuning to actually playing, and was still bad, but had found a rhythm that was at least internally consistent. "What will you do?" she said. "After, when the auction's over." "Go back to work," he said. "Prescott has a herd coming through in 2 weeks. After that, a job in the northern counties." He was quiet. "It's itinerant work. Has been for a long time. Do you want it to stay that way?" He looked at her. The question had landed with more weight than she'd entirely intended, or maybe she'd entirely intended it and was pretending otherwise. Either way, it was out there. "I don't know," he said. It was an honest answer, not a romantic deflection, not a studied non-answer, just the actual truth of a person who had been moving through the world for a long time and hadn't recently stopped to examine what he was moving toward. "I've been good at not knowing for a while." "That's not the same as being comfortable with it," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You've known me 2 days. 2 full days," she said. "And you've told me more about how you see things in those 2 days than most people tell you in 6 months. I'm observant, my mother's daughter." He was quiet again, but it was a different quiet than the others. A thoughtful one, the quiet of a person turning something over in their hands. "Sulphur Creek," he said. "Is it a reasonable distance from the Prescott operation?" 40 miles, she said. "Give or take?" "That's a day's ride." "It is," she said. He nodded slowly. He was not, she could see, a person who made fast decisions about things that mattered. He thought, he weighed, he held things until they were settled enough to hold. She found she didn't mind that. She wasn't in a hurry. She had a roof to fix and a well to deal with, and a commission to complete, and presumably many other things that would make themselves known when she got back to the ordinary shape of her life. She had learned, these past 2 days, something she had probably known without knowing she knew it, that the ordinary shape of a life was not a lesser thing, that the work of making something well, of keeping notes that might matter, of finishing what had been started, was not background noise to some more significant existence. It was the significant existence, the whole of it. Her mother had known that, had lived it in every seam and every written line. "I'll send word about Corrigan," Coulter said. "End of the week." "I know you will," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face settled finally into something less guarded. Not open, exactly. He was not a man who was going to become open overnight, and she wouldn't have trusted it if he had, but less defended. "You're going to do something with that commission account," he said, "beyond one rancher's shirts." "I don't know yet," she said. "I've been thinking about it." She had been, in the back of her mind, even as the day moved through its complications, about the women in this valley and in towns like this one who made garments for other people and kept nothing for themselves, about the widowed woman who had bought the lighter dress and paid exact coin and left without fuss, about Helen Birch, writing on the last piece of paper with her straight spine and her careful hand, about what it would mean to have a place, not just a traveling table, but an actual place, where those women could bring their work and have it valued accurately. It was not a formed plan. It was more like the corner of a plan, visible enough to know the shape of the whole thing would eventually be findable. When it's more than thinking, she said, I'll write it down. He nodded. He understood, she thought, the particular discipline of not forcing a thing before it was ready. They were alike in that, she and this man she had known for 2 days, both of them the kind of people who moved carefully and held things until they were sure, and who didn't say things they didn't mean, which meant the things they said carried more weight than they might have otherwise. She held out her hand. He looked at it for a moment, then shook it. His hand was rough in the way of someone who worked with rope and leather and animals, warm in the way of a person who runs a degree or two warmer than comfortable. Safe road, he said. You too, she said, when you get back to yours. She went to the hotel and wrote the letter to Aldridge at the Meade County paper that night, carefully, by lamplight, paraphrasing from memory and from observation rather than from the notes themselves, describing what could be publicly verified by anyone who looked at the pattern of land transfers in the Red Hollow Valley over the past 8 years. She wrote it in the plain, direct language her mother had taught her. No flourishes, no embellishments, just the facts arranged in the order that made them most understandable. It took her an hour and a half. She read it twice, changed 2 things, and left it as it was. In the morning, she paid her bill at the hotel, settled Grover into his harness, loaded the trunk, and drove out of Red Hollow as the sun was still low and the town was still mostly quiet. The same ridge she'd come over 2 days ago was there, and Grover climbed it at his own pace, and when she reached the top, she didn't stop to look back, which was not because she didn't want to, but because she understood that looking back at things was only useful when you were done with them, and she was not done with this. 3 weeks later, in Sulphur Creek, a letter arrived from a man named Aldridge. He had questions. He had been doing some looking into the pattern she'd described, and he had found, through public land records, 4 of the 7 transfers she'd referenced. He wanted to know if she was willing to speak further, on background, as a source whose name would not appear in the eventual article. She wrote back the same day. Yes. 6 weeks after that, another letter arrived. This one from Coulter Boone. It was brief, in handwriting that was more deliberate than easy, the handwriting of a man who wrote when he had something to say rather than from habit. Corrigan had removed himself from the Ortega panel, citing a scheduling conflict. The arbitration had proceeded. The Ortegas had received a ruling on the southern boundary in their favor, with interest on the disputed land value. At the bottom of the letter below his name, he had written, Prescott work finished early. 40 miles is a day's ride. She read that last line 3 times. Then she put the letter in the drawer where she kept her mother's pattern sheets, alongside the notes that had started all of it, and went back to the commission shirt she was finishing for the rancher because the work didn't wait and she had standards to maintain. The roof had been fixed in the 2nd week by a man from town who she'd paid with some of the auction money and some alteration work on his wife's winter coat. The well was still brackish, but she'd found a temporary solution that held, and a more permanent one was being planned. Grover had new shoes. The kitchen table where her mother used to sit and write had been cleared of the accumulated papers of grief and was now a working surface again, spread with patterned sheets and the measurements of the rancher's wife, who had asked, shyly, as though not sure the question was appropriate, whether Marlowe could make something for her too. She could. That was the whole of it in the end. Not a transformation, not a grand conclusion, not the satisfying clang of justice delivered all at once like a hammer on a bell. Life didn't work that way, and she'd never expected it to. What it was instead was this. A woman who had ridden 11 days to sell her dead mother's dresses had sold them all. She had stood her ground when standing it was uncomfortable. She had used what she had. Not everything, not recklessly, but with the kind of accuracy that comes from knowing the difference between what you can do now and what you need to hold for later. She had given the Ortegas back one piece of what had been taken from them. She had put a thread into the hands of a reporter who knew what to do with it. None of it was finished. The Vance operation was still the largest in the valley. Garvey was still running his bank. The 6 other families were still in whatever circumstances they'd ended up in after losing their land, and most of those circumstances were not good, and nothing she'd done was going to retroactively fix that. She knew it. She held it clearly without prettying it up into something more bearable. But threads, pulled carefully and in the right direction, unravel things over time. Her mother had known that, had sat at a kitchen table in Sulphur Creek and written down what she heard and trusted that the unraveling would happen eventually, even if she wasn't there to see it. Marlowe was there to see it, or the beginning of it, which was something. She bit off the thread on the rancher's shirt, the last seam, reinforced exactly as her mother had taught her, and held it up in the window light to check the work. It was good, not perfect. The left cuff sat about a degree off square, which would settle once it was washed, but she knew it was there and it bothered her slightly. Her mother would have noticed too. Her mother would have said, fix it or leave it, but know which one you're doing and why. She turned the cuff under by a fraction and took 3 more stitches. Fixed. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward evening in the ordinary way of afternoons in Sulphur Creek, without drama, without events. A dog barked somewhere down the road. The wind came through the kitchen window and moved the pattern sheets slightly. Grover, in the pen out back, had opinions about his feed and was communicating them to no one in particular. She folded the shirt along the seams the way her mother had taught her. Always along the seam, never against it. A crease in the wrong place tells the customer the maker doesn't pay attention. Then she started on the next one.